few minutes for everyone to join, not minutes, we'll give a few seconds for everyone to join because we haven't got a long time in this breakout session. Just while we're waiting to say who I am, my name is Dr. Jo Stubley. I'm a medical psychotherapist and I'm the lead clinician in the Tavistock Trauma Service. And I'm going to be talking, I hope, for about 20 minutes so that there's then time to go through some of the questions. And the title today is Survival and the Psychological Defences that are employed looking at COVID-19, and in particular, as is part of this conference, looking at the healthcare workforce. So I also wanted to say that I am going to make sure that these slides are available to everyone. There's a process that I think you've already been told, but to be told again, tomorrow morning you'll be able to log onto the site and to get the slides. Now I'm saying that partly because I've been aware that over the period of listening to the really interesting talks so far this morning, that it's not always possible to see all of the slides. So you will get an opportunity to see those tomorrow. I thought it might be helpful for us to start with a description of psychological trauma. Now, this is something that comes from Judith Herman, who coined the term complex trauma. And she says that the core experiences are disempowerment and disconnection from others. Now, I think that's worth just stopping and thinking about in relation to COVID-19. The sense of disempowerment, which I think links to an enormous amount of helplessness that we've all felt in a variety of ways, whether that's been in the workplace or personally, and disconnection from others, which inevitably has come out of lockdown and social distancing. I think it's also important to say at this point that although I am in the trauma field and I am talking about this in relation to what trauma research, both the sort of neurobiological research, but also psychoanalytic trauma work might help us understand, I am not equating this with talking about pathology or psychopathology in all healthcare workers. I'm talking about the ordinary response that may well cause difficulties. So it's about the ordinary or normal response in extraordinary circumstances. Now, I don't know how much you can see of this slide. I put this in partly because I was so pleased to learn how to do this on my PowerPoints, and I love a good diagram. What I wanted to try and capture, if you can see it, is the complexity of all of the different impacts in relation to COVID-19. Whether that is living with the threat of the virus, the impact of lockdown and social isolation, the impact of having the infection itself, the impact of bereavements, which many of us have experienced, not only in terms of loss of loved ones or other staff members, but also the many losses that we have faced over this time. The variety of psychosocial stresses that have been evident and will continue in terms of the potential for ongoing economic recession, the particular difficulties frontline workers have faced, and the way in which COVID has also impacted on mental health services. So thinking particularly about healthcare workers, I want to really emphasise that I am talking about what is essentially a very resilient population. We see this from a variety of studies, looking, for instance, at some of the work that went on post-SARS and MERS epidemics. There was evidence that frontline and healthcare workers were 10% less likely to develop symptoms than the general population. However, as has been discussed so far today, we have had the impact of over 10 years of austerity in this workforce, and that has taken its toll, with evidence suggesting an increase in depression, anxiety, post-traumatic symptoms, suicide, and substance misuse. And so this is the background on which COVID-19 hit the healthcare workforce. We've heard a little bit today about the impact of that on the workforce. I thought that some of the things that Neil Greenberg was saying were particularly helpful in understanding that. For instance, around moral injury and institutional betrayal. We've heard a little bit about some of the groups that might be more at risk, those who have been redeployed. Of course, we also now know that Black and ethnic minority groups have been more at risk. We know that healthcare workers have had to face an increased risk of infection and the anxieties about bringing that infection home to their families and the impact of that. They've had to face, for many, the reality of infection and for some, intensive care treatment. We knew pre-COVID that this causes a risk of up to 20% of developing PTSD, likely to be higher in the COVID population. And we know now that there are a variety of post-viral syndromes that people may get, including fatigue. I've just mentioned about bereavements. There's also the impact of the lockdown and social isolation on healthcare staff and the psychosocial factors. And I think to say in relation to psychosocial factors, one also has to hold in mind that the COVID pandemic has highlighted inequalities. I think it was our first speaker who talked about a kind of purification of the evidence of social inequality, and that has also applied to frontline and healthcare workers. So I want to think a little bit more about the threat of this virus, and I want to think about that in relation to the physiological response to threat, the fight, flight and freeze response. I want to just bring in something about attachment theory, and I want to be able to talk a little bit about how we might understand the kind of survival anxieties and defenses that come into being from a more psychoanalytic perspective. Now, as all of you medics will know, that the first place that threat really gets registered and attended to is the limbic system. After the sensory filtering through the thalamus, the limbic system, which Bessel van der Kolk, a well-known traumatologist, describes it, is the smoke detector. It's the place in which threat is registered and responded to, and we then get an activation of the threat system so that there is the HPA axis and the release of adrenaline causing a particular physiological response. That's known as the defense cascade. Now, don't worry about the tiny writing on this. It's not something that you need to look at, but if you can just see that with threat, we get, first of all, a fight-flight reaction. That is our sympathetic nervous system activation. And this is what gets us ready for action. And it is a physiological response that involves a hyperarousal. And I think this is an important concept for us to remember, because for me, this links in with why people get anxious and develop some of the post-traumatic symptoms. If the arousal is prolonged and if there is helplessness in relation to it, then what we can move to is the parasympathetic nervous system gets activated, and instead of the fight-flight, we then get the freeze response. Now, we know that this is similar to the situation where there's a large predator and a small mammal who is trapped, can't do anything else. They feign death, and again, this is physiological. They collapse. Everything slows down in that parasympathetic kind of way. And from a trauma perspective, what we know is that this is often associated with dissociation. Now, we think about that in terms of the escape when there's no escape. It's how our mind begins to switch off when things are too much. Now, that might be a minor kind of sense of things becoming distant to us so that we feel emotionally numb. Or at its extreme, it's those descriptions of feeling I wasn't in my body and I was watching this from the end of the bed. And this is really important, this defense cascade, because if you consider threats that were happening repeatedly in relation to the kinds of experiences that healthcare workers were having during COVID, you can see that these kinds of experiences were being activated again and again. Now, Stephen Porges has talked about this in relation to the metaphor of safety. So he brings up, first of all, this yellow zone of danger, which is the hyperarousal sympathetic nervous system response. This is the fight-flight that I was talking about, first of all. If that's prolonged or there's a long period of helplessness, one can move into the red zone, which is the life threat. And that's when the parasympathetic nervous system gets activated. We get the freeze response, and there is dissociation. Now that's part of, as you will remember, the parasympathetic nervous system is mostly the vagus nerve. What Porges has described is that there are two parts to the vagus nerve, and he picks up the more evolutionary advanced part, which is called the ventral vagus nerve, and says that this is our safety part of the autonomic nervous system. The ventral vagus has nerve endings in the gut, the heart, around the voice box, around the mouth and the eyes. This is our social engagement system. And this is really important because it helps to turn off the danger and the life threat systems. So when we engage with others, a welcome smile or good eye contact or a voice that makes you feel calm, that's activating our safety system. And of course, touch also does that too. And touch is particularly important because it can release oxytocin. And we know that one of the difficulties with the social isolation and the lockdown was that many people really missed those hugs from important people who were outside of their lockdown. And this is part of what then didn't get activated to help people feel safe and secure. And so we get a kind of paradox that happened during this period. For many, particularly frontline staff, the fear system was, in this way I've been describing, being repeatedly activated at a physiological level. The way that we usually respond to this is to move towards our attachment system, the people that make us feel safe and calm. And when people couldn't do that, the frontline workers who would come home and be too frightened to be near their loved ones because of the fear of contamination or being isolated alone at home, not being able to activate the attachment system meant that the fear system kept on being online. Now we think about this from a trauma perspective in a particular way. This diagram is also known as the window of tolerance. In that central zone, what they're calling here the optimal arousal zone, this is when we function at our best. It is the place in which we can think, concentrate, feel, even think about what we're feeling, where we can be compassionate and considerate and have empathy for others. But when we are under threat, we get triggered into the hyperarousal at the top, that sympathetic fight-flight. When we are under prolonged stress, we can go down into the hypoarousal at the bottom, the freeze and the dissociative area. And one can see that one of the difficulties with this is that if you're in those two areas at the top and the bottom, it makes it much harder to be able to think about what's going on. One's in a space in which there is action occurring all the time. Now we think about this in a similar way from a psychoanalytic perspective of what we call the survival anxieties. And these were anxieties that are very linked to the early phases of life, the kinds of life and death anxieties that we postulate very early infants have to cope with. These are anxieties of annihilation, fragmentation, disintegration and persecution. Awful big anxieties that require really big defences to manage them. And we would call these splitting, projection and projective identification, and I'll say a bit about those. So if you're living in a really frightening, chaotic, overwhelming world because of the level of threat that's coming at you, one way to try and manage that is to split. You separate things into categories, often of very good and very bad, and they are held very separate. And that begins to make some sense of the world. And this happens at an unconscious automatic level. I think we saw an example of this when Donald Trump, right near the start of the COVID-19, spoke about the Chinese virus. That was Chinese very bad, America very good. It was a way of splitting. And I think we might understand that phenomena happening in a number of different ways. Now, projection and projective identification involve where what is unbearable inside of us, unconsciously we get rid of and we locate in another. That's the projection bit. The identification bit is that it can have an impact on the other. And I'm going to give some examples of this in a moment. because these anxieties and defenses lead to particular ways of relating that are again linked to what I was saying about that window of tolerance. There is a move towards rivalry and competition when you are in a state of threat, when you feel that you are trying to survive. There's loss of nuance and ambivalence, and you can see that, for instance, with splitting. If you are in a very good or very bad, there's no room for anything in between. So the kinds of persecutory anxieties that this sort of survival kind of state sets up, I think were worsened by the invisibility of the threat with COVID. The notion that there were poisonous particles out there that we couldn't see that might infect us at any moment made many of us feel much more persecuted. I also think that at times the military metaphor made this worse. For people to feel that there was an enemy that they had to do battle with, but they couldn't see that enemy, that makes it even more frightening and raises the anxieties. And I think that those sorts of things, as I was saying, this makes it much more difficult then to be able to think, to cooperate, and to have compassion with others. And we've also all had to deal with a loss of the usual normal omnipotence that we have. I think one example of this for me was that sense at the start of lockdown of sitting down with my diary and just having to cancel almost everything else, everything that was in there. Partly because we didn't know anymore what was going to happen when those things had been written in with such certainty. So to come back to these defences, I think the other thing that we've seen in relation to splitting has been the hero metaphor. NHS staff being given this wonderful clap every week where they've been told they're heroes and the rainbows have been done, of course came from a very good place. But it also put people, I think, at times in a very difficult position. Because if you're idealised in that way, how do you then become an ordinary human being who needs to eat, who needs to sleep, who needs to take a holiday when this is over? I think splitting has also been evident in the increase in racism that we saw that has been a part of the Black Lives Matter becoming more evident again. Now, in relation to projection and projective identification, I think that Neil Greenberg was touching on this issue in relation to the way in which we've seen in the past that there has been a sort of inrush of counsellors and therapists and well-wishers after disasters who want to help. Now, of course, there's reparative and altruistic parts of this, but I think that when there was this huge rush in at the beginning of COVID, one might also see that in terms of the projection of helplessness into the NHS staff, so that then the therapist who wish to rush in can feel that they are active, able to do something, can feel less helpless themselves. And so the vulnerability for that moment gets located in the NHS staff. Now, the defence of dissociation, which I was talking about a moment ago, we might also see in terms of the numbing, cutting off, shutting down. And in relation to fight-flight, the kinds of arguments and grievances that can get going, the increase in interpersonal violence that we've seen reported, I think even in the news today, or avoidance phenomena in terms of flight where people just stop having contact with others. And one of the difficulties that we can often see is that in trying to manage on our own the window of tolerance, people can end up using drugs, alcohol, deliberate self-harm, gambling, and even extreme exercise as a way of trying to get themselves back into the window. So what do we know that helps, protects, and heals? And we've been hearing a fair bit about this already today, and it's not rocket science. Social connection is vital. Self-care is vital, because a lot of what I've been talking about is located in the body, physiological responses. The capacity to think about and reflect with others about what has happened is vital. And having the appropriate containment, leadership, and institutional structures to help with that is important too. Thinking about containment, we might think about that in terms of how a psychoanalyst, Wilfred Bion, described containment as thinking about these very disturbed, distressed babies coping with survival anxieties. And a mother tries to think about, to take in, to detoxify what the baby is struggling with, which leads to the much calmer and more thoughtful engagement in the second picture. Thinking about the healthy healer, this is really just another way of saying what I've said, a focus on well-being, social connection, reflection and containment, and leadership and organisation. And that needs to come from a variety of levels: population, community, NHS structures and individuals. Now, I'm just going to end with my last two slides on a couple of suggestions for this. Now, one of them is in relation to vocabulary. I think this needs to stop being called the recovery or restoration phase. I think for many of us, this doesn't fit. I think for many particular NHS staff coping with the influx of the normal work that was on hold for so long, this doesn't fit with recovery phase. So I'm requesting we call it transition phase. My other request is for us to rename social distancing to be physical distancing. We don't want to be socially distanced from others. It's actually really important that we are socially connected. And I think that vocabulary is important in talking about this. So I think this transition phase needs long-term intervention. As the WHO says, this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. Population and community-based interventions need to be thinking about the social connection, because we know that altruism and pro-social behaviour reduces these symptoms, and thinking about the well-being, because we also know that things like exercise, gardening, yoga helps enormously with post-traumatic symptoms, and addressing inequality gaps and the need for safety nets. Within the NHS, I think we need to be able to look both at what leadership might require to be able to do the task that's required, and what organisational change might be necessary. I would put that under the heading of the 3 C's: collaboration, cooperation, and compassion. And I think that the attention to the basic needs of staff, as has been said in several of the talks today, is vital. What I've been hearing of, the coffee machines that are being taken back, the comfortable sofas that are being lost, the well-being rooms that are being closed, free parking which is being lost. This is problematic. And I think this request earlier on today for staff dining rooms, it's a basic but essential requirement. Neil Greenberg talked about the strengthening of teams and trained managers or supervisors, absolutely important. And I think embedding reflective practices, embedding reflective spaces in teams is vital. But all of that in terms of access requires leadership to be actively involved. And so then access to appropriate interventions need to be timely, flexible, and appropriate. Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to stop screen sharing. Good, okay. And I am going to exit full screen. And then I'm going to try and find, hang on, I'm still on screen sharing, so I need to get rid of that. This is when there we go. So I come back to here, and now I can start to look at your questions, and I hope you've got a lot of those, because I want to hear from people about this. Okay. So I'm going to have a look at questions now. I think that, okay, so there's a question here, first of all. It was a pre-submitted question. How can we support doctors who have had to step back from frontline work due to shielding or mental health issues? I think that's a really interesting question, because one of the things that it raises is that there have been differences of experiences over this time. Not everyone has had the same experience. And sometimes that can lead people to feel that they should feel guilty because they haven't been at the front line, or that they may not be able to be thought about or to access the kinds of things that we're talking about. When I was describing these basic requirements, I think they should apply just as much to people who cannot access things physically, and we need to think, as I think was described so well by Dr. Tolchinsky, how we can do that from remote working ways. So how people end up being able to access good team support, peer support, the appropriate involvement from well-being from a remote access is also really important. Okay, now there was another question here which has also got a lot of thumbs up. Okay, so yes, this one. I am horrified to hear about well-being structures being dismantled. How can we push back about this? Well, so am I. And I think that this is one of the issues that we really do have to push back on as an NHS workforce. One of the things that I think became very painful was when the clapping on a Thursday night stopped, the notion then that we get back to normal and we call this recovery phase was part of what I found very painful. This is a moment in which all of us can push to have what are the basic requirements for this kind of work to be properly embedded so that it's not just about recovery, it is about ongoing work. It's about how we get the appropriate care to look after ourselves, not only in a time of need. Okay, I'm going to look at a couple more questions because we haven't got a huge amount of time. Let's just see. Okay, there's one here. What is the proactive role of both time-out, mandated annual leave and mental health interventions within and without existing team structures? I think this was touched on earlier. I think it was Dr. Tolchinsky again, who I thought brought a really beautiful personal experience in relation to COVID-19 when he talked about the need to be able to acknowledge and heal inside the team and to allow people to enjoy their lives. Now, I think that links with what I'm stressing, the psychological well-being, attending to the body, and the social connection. And we need to be able to look at these things in relation to what is a part of our workforce and is necessary. So taking time off is very much a part of that. Supporting each other to do so is also really necessary. Okay, I've got let's have a look. One last question in 1.5 minutes. Fatigue and trauma during crisis response, the impact of agile response to COVID needs, and what is the impact on personal resilience of the medical workforce? You see, I think fatigue is a particularly important one because we know that fatigue can be a normal part of what has been an extraordinary experience. People are really tired. They've had all of that adrenaline rushing around in their systems for so long. They have had to manage these threat systems happening over and over again. They have also potentially had COVID, which itself has fatigue as a part of it. There is also the post-COVID fatigue, which seems to be a kind of immune inflammatory response. So there's a lot of reason to acknowledge why we might all be feeling fatigued and what might need to be done in terms of increasing our resilience, which comes back to the factors that I've been describing. I'm aware I'm right on the line here. It's looking down to 22, 21 seconds. I want to thank you all. I know it can be quite a weird experience. It certainly is for me to be talking and not being able to see you, but I hope that this is the beginning of a discussion. And I hope that as a group of NHS staff, we can continue to have that together. Thank you all for joining in.